Thanks, Frederick. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm happy to be here. So please feel free to ask questions, interfere, raise your hands, or just talk. I'm happy to take questions throughout. Okay, so what drives my research? So I come from machine learning. That's my background, but I work a lot with our hospital. And it's using patient data to personalize treatment, right? That when I started working in this field, I was like, obviously, this is the most important problem or the most promising problem, just to use data to find how to treat patients. Of course, since then, I've learned there are many other interesting problems in the field, but I'm still kind of sticking to this. And this problem of using patient data to personalize treatment and to pick the best treatment for a patient, of course, is especially important in cases where we have no clear guidelines. So maybe the AI could help the doctor. That's the dream. So here's our dream. Someone comes into the doctor, she, let's say, correctly diagnosed that they have the condition, and let's say they have two possible treatments. And throughout this talk, I'll mention only two possible treatments, but of course it could be more than two, but this is for simplicity. And sometimes the doctor, she might not be sure what's the best treatment for this patient. And we dream that we might have this AI assistant that would recommend some treatment for this particular patient. Okay, so, okay, this is what we want to do. And my first claim is if we want to actually do this, we have to think about causality. So Frederick mentioned causality in his opening, because decision making, we're taking actions in the world. So we have to have some kind of causal model saying, if we take this action, this is what will happen. We have to go beyond just mere correlations. We don't want to say, okay, patients who take this medication are usually better. We want to know that they're better because they take this medication. And this need for causal modeling is always there, but it's especially acute if we're using observational data, again, as Frederick mentioned. So what's observational data? Data collected not through a clinical trial, but through routine practice from the hospitals, that, as was mentioned here, clinics, maybe patients themselves. We have all these apps that can record data. So this is kind of data. And the main challenge with using observational data for causal modeling is that we might have confound. And I'll go more deeply into confounding in a few slides. But basically, is we're not sure if the correlations we see are causal or not, and that's a challenge I'll address soon. And now, especially for people coming from machine learning, there's another related challenge, which is we don't really know if we're correct before we deploy the system. So let's say I built some fancy AI that makes treatment recommendations. I don't have a test set. I don't know. Let's say anytime my system recommends in hindsight, oh, this patient should have been treated differently, we don't know what would have happened. So we don't have the labels. So we're not in the classic supervised learning situation where we can have a held out test set and just look at what happened and see if we're 90% accurate, 95% accurate. No, we can't know for sure. And this is a big challenge. And again, we'll see how we kind of try to address this. So what I'll talk about here is how do we address these challenges? And in general, how do we build these treatment recommendation systems in a way that we're confident and avoid harm? Okay. So I'll propose some best practices framework. So this will be somewhat technical, but I won't go into all these deeply into the methods, but more into this framework of how do you use any of the available methods safely for this kind of task. So we won't be focused on any specific algorithm in this talk. And generally, the framework we propose for building such systems has three phases. And the first is what we call the identification phase. And it's basically a way to figure out whether the data we have, let's say the data from the hospital, can even do what I wanted. Sometimes we might be kind of enamored. We have like these huge data set, lots of patients, lots of measurements, but it still might not be good enough for the task we want to have. So big data is not always good data. Assuming we're satisfied with this phase, we go over to the estimation phase, which is basically using all these machine learning models to actually build a treatment recommendation model. But this phase only kicks in after we're satisfied with the first. And after we do this, we have a validation phase, which is basically trying to see, are we really sure? Because this is a clinical task, we really have to we have a high bar. We set a high bar for ourselves to avoid harm. Okay. So let's formulate the problem. And this is a slide I think Frederick created, or we created jointly many years ago, and it's been kind of iterating. Still useful. So here's how we imagine the problem. This patient comes in. We have her medical file. She has, let's say, high blood sugar. And we're debating between two treatments for this patient, for Anna, let's say t equals 0 and t equals 1. And we imagine two futures for Anna, which is what would happen to her if she were to receive t equals 0 and t equals 1. And we denote these by y0 and y1. And these are potential outcomes. These are what could happen to Anna. Okay? And these are known, the Rubin-Neyman potential outcomes. So y0, y1, what would have happened? And what we're interested in is something called the conditional average treatment effect. It's basically saying for Anna, as she's represented by X, X is everything we know about Anna, all her medical records and so on, is the expectation of y1 minus y0 conditional on X, which is basically, would she be better off taking one medication versus the other? Okay? This is something we'll want to estimate using machine learning tools. And the problem with this quantity is we never directly observe it, because Anna, in our historical records, she received one of the two medications. She didn't receive both. If she did, it might be different also, right? Taking two medications is not the same as taking each one separately. So for Anna, we only got to see y1 or y0. We never saw both. And still we need to know both. And moreover, which of these two kind of parts of the case of this quantity we get to see is not random, because patients are not assigned treatment randomly, right? Anna and her physician probably had some discussion, and her physician made a choice for various reasons, which determines which of the two parts of the case we get to kind of see, and then we have to infer the part that we didn't see. And this is sometimes known as the fundamental problem of causal inference. We only get to see one of the futures, but we want to know all of the possible futures for each patient. So before I go on, any questions about this? Because this is the basic step.
Yes. Perhaps, just to make it clear, it's the blood sugar that we are interested in.
Sorry, the blood sugar?
It's the blood sugar that we are interested in.
Yes, in this example.
In the variable.
Yeah, the blood sugar, had she been treated with one treatment versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
Did I get you right? The information that you put into this equation is based on the data from the individual patient.
Yes.
All right. But then you have a huge amount of data from more or less exactly the same type of patient, right? And you use that, of course, in your model.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm a female, where well, gender, age, address, socioeconomic status, basic lab findings, etc., etc. Or
yes.
then when just to get to me, you feed back the results, so to speak. I mean, Anna got the treatment 1, okay, and the outcome is whatever. Let's call it whatever. And then you feed back. I mean, it's sort of different result. We feed back to the system. So the system, for each and every patient going through the system, the accuracy will increase, right?
Yes, and that's an excellent point. And you're kind of, I'll get to this in a few slides, but okay, if you're asking, but the problem is we might have a patient which looks very similar to Anna that received a different treatment, right? And we might use it.
Sure.
But the problem is we might have missing information. We might not really know why the treatment was given or not given to any patient. And that is the problem of hidden confounding. And I'll give some examples of that.
Yeah, but is that really important to know why?
Yes, turns out it is. For this kind of task. For knowing what would have happened otherwise.
Yes, I buy that. I buy that. I'm a physician. So yes, all right.
Okay, and I have some examples. And that this is strongly related to where's Frederick? Oh, ran away. He's busy. Well, he's organizing it. And so Frederick's Learning Hospital is about this, because we have to understand how clinicians assign treatment.
Yeah, excellent. I buy that straight away.
So okay, I went over this. So just to kind of close the loop to make everything clear, how do we go from this quantity to recommendation? So we have this, what would have happened under one treatment versus the other. We estimate it. So then we have this hat. We use some model to estimate it, and I'll talk about this model a lot, but assume we have such a model. And then we just present a recommendation for the doctor. If this is negative, that means that under t equals 1, we think Anna will have a lower blood sugar. We'll recommend t equals 1. If our estimate is positive, we'll recommend t equals 0. And maybe we want to also be, again, kind of on the safe side. If we have high uncertainty, we might defer. We might say, okay, we don't know. We'd rather not make a bad recommendation. that could harm patients and also lose the trust of the physician. So we also have to take account of uncertainty. Okay. So again, we can use, there's a bunch of tools for estimating this Kate. A lot of algorithms using everything from random forest, deep network, etc. But all of these algorithms that have been kind of proliferating in the machine learning literature in the last few years, they only work under some strict set of what are known as causal identification conditions. So I mentioned the first phase is identification. So all of these nice algorithms have some conditions that they have to kind of comply with. And I'll mention 3 of them. One is no hidden confounders. Basically means we recorded everything that went into the treatment decision. The other is common support. That means that Anna could have plausibly received both treatments. Maybe Anna was barred from receiving one of the treatments because she has some kidney condition, and this medication is just not allowed. So that we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And also something called no interference. I won't go into these. But the problem is that most of these assumptions, especially the no hidden confounders assumption, is not testable from data. So the situation is thus: we have this quantity we need to estimate to recommend treatment. We have a bunch of fancy algorithms, more or less fancy, but they all work under a condition which we can't test from data. Okay, so they're like, we have this great method, but it will only work if some condition holds, and you can't have a statistical test for this condition. Okay, so this is somewhat unsatisfactory. But the point is that these assumptions are not testable from data, but we can build confidence whether they hold or not. But in order to build confidence, we have to talk with the clinicians. We can't just take the data set and run a test. We have to understand how treatment is actually assigned in practice as represented in the data. Okay? So a lot of the framework, the part of identification, is how to build confidence in this assumption. And let's talk about this, specifically this no hidden confounding or all confounders are measured assumption. So how could this fail? When will this assumption fail in our data? So here are some typical scenarios which kind of we've encountered. Let's say treatment is assigned based on some unrecorded patient preference. Okay, so some patient tells the doctor, "Oh, this will give me, heartburn. I can't take this. I can't do this. Give me some other medication." If this preference relates to other outcomes, if older patients or younger patients or some other aspect of the patient relates to the outcome and to this preference, we might have hidden confound. Okay, and these preferences are often not set in the data. We don't have them, or maybe we have them in text that we haven't used. Maybe treatment is assigned based on the level of support a patient has at home. So again, this is a factor that might affect the treatment decision. It might affect the outcome. Do I have someone at home that will help me take the medication or not? Okay, having someone at home might affect my outcome in many other ways, whether I live alone or with someone. Again, this might not be recorded in the data. Maybe there is some data, for example, imaging that was used to determine treatment, and the imaging data, is big. It was hard to get out of the hospital. I'm a lazy machine learning person. I just left it in the hospital and didn't use it. All these cases are scenarios where we have some important factor which could affect treatment decision, could affect the outcome, is not in the data, and if any of these happens, we have a problem. Our basic condition doesn't hold, and we can use all these fancy methods, but we can't trust their outcome in that scenario. Okay? So we need to take care to be sure we're not in one of these scenarios or any of the scenarios. And a second major challenge, which is related to this, is that there's no test. So as I've mentioned, we have a recommendation. If a recommendation algorithm ends up matching exactly what the doctors did, then we're kind of useless, right? We're doing what the doctors did anyway. So no need. Assuming our recommendation, at least in hindsight, says, "Oh, this patient would have benefited from a different treatment," we don't have a link. We don't know what would have happened, and still we want to develop a method and so, and of course, this is all high stakes. Even a pilot system might cause harm, not just harm in the sense of clinical harm, because we do have a clinician making a decision, but harm in the sense of losing trust from the clinical team. So how can we still kind of build confidence and deploy some treatment recommendation system in this scenario? So any questions before I move on? Yes.
It just reminds me of the ENIAC systems in 1970s. They had the same kind of problems, the expert system, and they wanted to model a doctor.
Yes. This has been going with us for a long, long time.
It's exactly like
These
this.
kind of things. That's true. Okay. So this is our framework, which is basically kind of a set of steps that we propose following when building such a system. I will not go over all of them. I will only kind of go into a few, but we propose this framework as a way to build confidence when kind of learning and deploying, before deploying such a system. And the first step I want to talk about is identification. So as I mentioned, this is knowing whether the data can even do what I want it to do. It's before I fit any model. And we call this the target system. This follows Miguel Hernan's target trial, Hernan, who came up with the phrase, the learning possible. He's a big star in our field, very profound thinker. So the first step, which I don't know, for some might sound obvious, but for others not, so I'll mention it. We want to define exactly the setting and context of the treatment recommendation system. This is so important, just really talking with the clinicians and understanding where exactly in their workflow is the decision taking place. Where would they want this recommendation to pop up? Like very, very precisely, like at what minute within the kind of workflow do they want this to happen? And some points that we've kind of come up from our experience for discussion about this with our clinical partners is this decision made at a well-defined point in time? Some decisions are kind of diffuse. Maybe there's kind of weeks of kind of maybe this, maybe that, and it's not maybe recorded well in the data, so we need to figure that out. Is there a small set of possible actions? If the set of possible actions is huge, most of our current methods might not work. Are there clear clinical guidelines? So sometimes, and this happened to me, a clinical partner came up and says, oh, there's guidelines, but I know they're wrong. There should be other guidelines. I'm sure there's some examples here clinicians can think about where they believe so. So they might be right, but if patients are actually treated by the guidelines, as long as the guidelines are adhered to, we can't help you because, at least I can't help you, maybe some of them can, because we can't see patients not treated by the guidelines. Okay, so there might be need for other methods, but the methods I'm talking about here cannot go forward in this case. If there are clear guidelines and if they're actually followed. So guidelines aren't always followed, as we know, but assuming both of these are kind of true. Even if there's no clear guideline, there might be kind of a practical guideline. Maybe in this hospital, we always treat patients this way. Okay, we never treat them any other way. So that's kind of a de facto guideline. We are still in the same problem. We don't see various treatments given to similar patients. So we need actual high variability in treatment decisions between physicians. Actually, just this morning, I was talking with an anesthesiologist here in the crowd, I can't see it, who was mentioning that for pain medication, and correct me if I'm wrong, there really are there are no guidelines, but it's really unclear and treatment is kind of given in a highly variable way, the gut feeling of the doctor. And that is actually a good situation for us because this kind of substitutes for a clinical trial, if you want. It substitutes the randomization that we have in clinical trial, have this randomness or arbitrariness in treatment. So we have to make sure this actually happens, because if treatment is given in a highly deterministic manner, again, we can't know what would have happened to patients if they were treated otherwise. And finally, this is also not always obvious. Do we agree what outcomes do we want to optimize? Like that's, again, not always the case. So we need to make sure we have that. If we can't agree on an outcome, we can't optimize. Okay? And all these points just help clarify the discussion with the clinicians about the role of the AI system.
Can I ask you briefly, how do you go about gaining the information from the clinicians?
We talk a lot.
You talk.
A lot. And my students go to the floor, kind of to the ward, and see how things are actually done.
Just to throw in here, but I hear what you say, that in my experience, being a physician myself, many physicians are completely unaware of their biases.
That's true. So I think I will mention this soon. Yes, the biases are definitely an issue. Let's see if I have this. Yes, so this is, I think, by the end of this slide, I should somewhat answer this question. So assuming we're satisfied with this, that we have a place that we think could be of value for a recommendation system, and all these points kind of are well understood, we need to actually see if the data matches our needs. So have we measured all or most of the known confounders? And again, confounders are things that affect both treatment and outcome. And here comes your point. Maybe doctors treat patients of certain ethnicity differently, right? We know this from data. I think most doctors will not admit or will not even acknowledge that they do that, but we know that happens, right? So this is at least something we might have recorded. A case where this might fail is if there's an important factor which unconsciously affects doctors and outcomes, and we don't have it in the data. Yeah, that is a problem. That is a risk we take. I think it's an open question. I think it varies how much of the treatment decision is affected by these unknown factors versus measured factors. It probably varies. But we might have, again, a failure point here. So, for example, in psychiatric care, a lot of the things that affect the treatment decision are not recorded in the data, at least in the data sets we have in Israel. It's considered more sensitive. So often in psychiatric care, for example, prescribing antidepressants, we might not have the confounders. And actually, we had a project where we said, we're sorry, we have a lot of data, but we don't have the right data. And we can't go on because we don't know what determines which antidepressant is prescribed to which patient. So we can't move on. We need temporal separation of the data recorded before and after. There's all kinds of things we need about this data. I won't go into all the details. Something that might help is a causal graph. I'm just curious, who here has heard of causal graphs? Okay, so some of you have. So this is the method for kind of understanding the data generating process, understanding what went on. We can build this graph, and basically it has all these medical and demographic and other factors, and which affects which. This is an actual graph we built with our clinical colleagues for anti-diabetic care. And this graph might include things that we know occur, but are not in the data. So we can take this graph, and there is kind of a process where you take this graph, you say what is measured, what is not, and you can kind of get an answer, which says, do you have identification? Do we have all the necessary confounders? We don't have to use the graphs, but sometimes they are useful. And the point is that really we might have kind of a no identification. And I mentioned this actually happens. Okay, we might do all these steps, build a graph, talk to the clinicians, and realize there are important confounders not in the data, and then we can't move on. And that's important. It saves everyone time and blood. Okay. Assuming we're happy with this, we can go into the next phase. And this is what I call the estimation phase. And this is basically estimating this quantity K with all these wonderful methods that have been developed over the last 5 or 10 years. We also need to estimate something called the propensity score, which is basically modeling how the doctors treat. So we built 2 models, one for what would be the outcome under various treatments. And just to go back to your question, basically all these conditions are saying we can do this. We can use other patients to infer what would have happened otherwise. Okay, so we can mathematically prove that it happens if these conditions hold. So we build these models. We model also the way doctors treat patients for various reasons. I will not go into the details of these here. Happy to talk about this offline. I want to talk about validation. So we built all these models, and as I mentioned, we have no test set. We can't use some held out data and compare between models, right? We're so used to this. I have a colleague who said we're spoiled in machine learning because we have this notion of validation set, which you don't always have. So let's say I use 2 methods for estimating K, one based on random forest, one based on deep learning. How do I know which is better? I don't have a test set. So there are ways to do this. Most of these methods have some regression or classification module within them, and we can evaluate them using standard metrics. And if we build some regression model and its mean squared error is terrible, we might not want to move on. If the machine learning component is doing terribly on the standard metrics, it will probably do terribly on the kind of more difficult causal metrics. We want to compare different models for consistency. We apply interpretability methods. We want to know if this makes sense, if the models make sense, or if they use some weird, unusual covariates. In one of our models, we found that this was for heart failure patients, and one of the most important covariates in the model was whether the patient was weighed in the clinic. Not their weight, but whether they were weighed or not. And that made us somewhat uneasy. That doesn't seem like a stable or good feature. We we eventually understood why it came up. It wasn't a mistake. This fact of whether a patient was weighted or not was indicative, was a proxy for many other things, but that's not a model we were comfortable deploying as one. So of course we talk with the clinical experts. We want to understand who are these patients who we recommend receive treatment or not, characterize them. Does it make sense? Where does our recommendation disagree with what actually happened? And we kind of characterize these populations, say, this is a patient population where a model disagrees with actual practice. We go to our clinical partners and ask them, does this make sense? We can even look at a single patient and say, look, here, this patient was treated this way. We think it was treated, he or she should have been treated otherwise. Does this make sense to you, or is it like completely off? Okay, so we have all these back and forth with our clinical partners to validate these models. And again, this might be kind of an exit point. Maybe our models suck. Maybe they give weird predictions. Maybe their AUC for something is 0.5. In these cases, we have to start again. And this might indicate that the data just is not good enough for what we want to do. Okay. Sorry. So any questions about this? Once. Yeah.
Did you try running it with when the patient is in front of the clinician?
Not yet.
Because the clinicians behave differently when they are looking at something where they feel their decisions would not be harmful compared with when they are sitting in front of a patient.
Oh, so you mean take a patient, show it to a clinician, the patient record?
No, I mean the real patient, that during the patient-doctor conversation, and you come up with your recommendations and ask doctor if the doctor is going to use it or not.
So we're trying to go into something like that. We don't have a system deployed yet, but we are going into such a situation.
Yeah, because any kind of data that you will get from patient-clinician agreement and disagreement would be biased, because the doctor at that time is not feeling the pressure that any kind of wrong decision would actually affect the outcome of a real human.
So the disagreement set is looking in hindsight and decisions that were actually made.
Mm-hmm.
We have the record of what decisions were actually made, and then we look back and say our system thinks it should have been different.
Yeah.
So this is based on historical decisions. But of course, you're right that we need to go prospectively. Yeah. Frederick, we also want to estimate the uncertainties. So we want to look which are the patients for which we have high uncertainty. Okay, so there are many reasons why our models might be uncertain. We might have just standard estimation error. We have a large but a finite number of samples. Models might be misspecified. All the usual reasons why models might be wrong. We also have a type of causal error, which is not usually present in kind of standard machine learning, which is basically saying, what do we have a bit of hidden confounding? So I said hidden confounding is terrible, we can't have it. But in reality, we always have at least some residual hidden confounding. So we want to estimate our uncertainty regarding hidden confounding. What if we have a limited amount of hidden confounding? Do our models kind of go crazy and start flipping all their decisions? So we estimate all these uncertainties jointly. This is kind of a big methods project, which I'm happy to talk about offline, to eventually get to the situation where we can defer a decision. We say we have uncertainty here. We might not want to make a recommendation. And again, we want to understand who are these patients. Maybe patients for certain populations are deferred more. And then we might have a fairness issue. And again, this helps us understand our model and be more comfortable with it. Yes.
Just one quick question here. So you mentioned before that you've talked about to clinicians about fitting this system or these recommendations into a clinical workflow. So have you discussed this notion of deferring also?
Yes, we have. They're comfortable with it. Some of them like it. And actually, we will use it. I will mention this later. We will use it. We plan to use it as part of our prospective evaluation of the model.
Have you done any work or seen the results where you also discuss sort of the cost of a feature? Because when I worked in the engineering domain, this is often one of the most important. So we want to understand the causal model, because then we understand more of what's going on. But then it's very different to build some kind of decision support based on that. Because some of the actually important features might be unreliable in the long term or too costly to collect and so on. So have you had any of those discussions?
That's a good point. And so far we're building only on what is recorded in the usual manner in the healthcare system. It is a very interesting problem, and there is a bit of work on that on how much is it worth for you to pay to get a feature to reduce confounding. That's a fascinating problem, but we haven't gone into that. Okay. Now, finally, the last point about estimation before I go into our kind of case studies is something called the policy value. So policy value is the metric we would like to optimize. So basically it says, if the physician followed our recommendations did exactly what we told them, what would be the outcome? So hopefully it would be better than what currently happens. Okay. So there's many different policies. Policies is just the way treatment is assigned to patients. There is the current policy, what we call the doctor's policy, which is what happens in practice right now at the hospital. And the policy value of the current doctor's policy is just the average outcome of the population. Okay, so the policy value for let's say treating second type 2 diabetics is just the average, let's say HbA1c in the population 1 year after treatment. So that's a policy value. And again, hopefully our system will generate a better policy value. So a good recommendation would have a good recommendation model, sorry, it should be model there, would have a better policy value than the doctor's policy. But the problem is we can't get around this fundamental problem, because estimating the policy value is itself a challenging causal problem. So we need everything that I said so far still applies here. We need all these conditions to hold, because this still we can't get around the fact that we don't know what would have happened to a patient if they were treated differently than they were actually treated. And so we don't really know what would have happened, but assuming we went through all the phases I've described and we're satisfied, we have ways to estimate this quantity with relative assuredness. Okay, so when I will present slides now, some of them will have a policy value, which is what would happen if physicians exactly followed our recommendations. Right, so before I go on to our case studies, any questions so far about this part?
I have a quick question about something you mentioned a few slides back. You said compare Kate estimators.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So we have all these different models for Kate estimation. And what if we run a causal forest and a deep learning method, and we find that the recommendations are completely kind of different, are completely in disagreement? That is kind of a reason for pause. They're like, they shouldn't be very different. They should roughly agree. If they really disagree, that means either we have strong model misspecification or some hidden confounding or some bug or something like that. So that is another one of our kind of validation steps, basically. And we just, for example, we just measure, let's say, the Pearson correlation of the recommendation vector between different methods. Okay. So I will present two case studies, one in more length. These were led by student and former student, Rom and Shima. And the first one, it was a collaboration with Khalid Research Institute. Khalid is a big healthcare provider in Israel, about 4 million people. And effects of two types of anti-diabetic drugs, second-line anti-diabetic drugs on type 2 diabetes patients who have not responded to first-line to metformin. And the goal was to reduce blood sugar measured in HbA1c. So we had these two treatments. Of course, there are more than two, but we focused on the population who received these two. Had more than 50,000 patients, a lot of covariates, which are potential confounders. And we went through the entire process. Okay, the graph I showed you was with people from Khalid. We did the entire process. I won't go into all the details. I just want to say something about the results we found here. So for patients who actually received sulfa, we found that about half would benefit from moving to DPP-4, which is a newer medication. For about half, we deferred. We had no recommendation, and only a small percent we thought should stay. Okay, so most patients we think should move to DPP-4. if we look at the patients who received DPP-4, again, we think most of them should have actually received DPP-4. Okay, so again, for both populations, we basically either don't know or think they should get DPP-4. Okay, and in this case, it's not obvious that we need personalization. Okay, so the answer is basically no. So we looked at the policy value of two things: the personalized treatment, or just the treatment of moving everyone to DPP-4, and basically they had the same value because our personalization was basically most people should get DPP-4. So as a fancy AI person, this is a bit disappointing, but as anyone else, it's actually nice because it's much easier. Okay, just DPP-4 is better, right? You don't need any kind of complicated system. Of course, this is simplifying things a bit, but what we found, there were clinical trials while we were working on that. A clinical trial came out showing an advantage of DPP-4, which is a kind of a nice validation. For the real world case, there are newer medications now. So sulfa is basically old school. And by the way, what we found is that this older type of medication was mostly prescribed by physicians who are older, not experts, in more disadvantaged areas of the country. So there was like a lot of interesting findings here, which are not related to our specific goal, but of course are very, very valuable for the healthcare system. And now the focus is on newer medications and you know, still collecting data because we need long follow-ups for this kind of. Okay, so this is our first example. I want to go to the second example, which I'll go into a bit more detail. This is about acute disease. So here the question and this is work with our university hospital, which is called Rambam. And this is about the causal effects of diuretics on kidney function in acute heart failure patients. Okay, so I'll explain what that means. And these are our clinical collaborators, Dr. Owen Caspi and Professor Dolan Aronson from our university and the hospital. So what happens here? This is the case where a patient has acute heart failure. They go into the hospital. These are very sick patients. About a third of them die within a year of their hospitalization. And a lot of times, the care they receive for their heart problem causes kidney injury. And then there's this need to balance systems. Okay, and our clinical partners say that they have poor guidance how to prescribe diuretics and blood pressure medication. So diuretics help alleviate the congestion, but they might hurt the kidney function. So we have about 2,000 hospitalized patients who have this condition. Again, we have many covariates, and we went, like this is a kind of 2-year or 3-year long process of really understanding the treatment process, the confounders, getting the data from the hospital, getting more data from the hospital, getting more data from the hospital. Every time we need more data, it's kind of takes time. But we've done this. And just empirically about the treatment dilemma that we kind of focused on was increasing the diuretic medications or leaving them the same or decreasing. So that's kind of the question. And those are the T equals 1, T equals 0. There's actually more than 2 treatments, but again, for this presentation, I'll talk only about 2. So just to clarify, treatment which we denote T equals 1 is decreased diuretics, and this often, not always, but often improves kidney function, but might hurt cardiac function. So there's need to balance the system, and we need to balance these multiple outcomes. And should increase, keep, or decrease diuretics for this patient. That's kind of the decision we want to help the clinicians make. So questions about the clinical setup? Yes.
What's the outcome you're measuring?
So we will be optimizing for kidney function as measured by serum creatinine, but there's actually also rehospitalization and mortality, which relate to the cardiac function. But we're now optimizing just for one, but it's an interesting question how to optimize for multiple outcomes. What was the question?
Is this your result?
So there's no result yet. So
Yeah.
This is the question.
Yeah.
I'll show our results. Okay. So this is the clinical question we want to kind of answer. And this is our result. So we ran our system optimizing for kidney function as measured in what's called return to baseline creatinine. So basically the creatinine, I'm sure, and any clinician here, please stop me if I'm saying something ridiculous. Creatinine rises, that indicates a kidney injury. And basically we want the creatinine to go back to what it was when they were first hospitalized. That would be ideal. And we measured this in percent return to baseline. So 100% means they return to their baseline. That's amazing. 0% means we did nothing. They're still with kidney injury. And so this will be presented at the top. Okay, this is the policy value that I mentioned earlier. What would happen to these patients? On the bottom, we have rehospitalization. Basically, the doctors can cheat. They can kind of do something that helps in the short term, but the patient is not actually helped and will come back within, I think this is 30 days to the hospital, and that's a bad indicator for cardiac function. So what we see here is what is currently happening in the hospital, in this Rambam hospital. We have the return to baseline is a bit more than 20%. Rehospitalization rate is nearly 8%. Now we measured various policies. So one is just decrease diuretics to everyone. Okay, and as expected, we have slightly worse. We believe there will be slightly worse kidney function and slightly better hospitalization. Remember, kidney function higher is better, and for rehospitalization rate lower is better. Okay, so this is what we think would happen if we increase diuretics for everyone. This will help with the kidney function because this helps clear the kidneys, but we have higher rehospitalization rate. So that is not a good trade-off. And what we think would happen under our machine learning policy is kind of the best of both worlds. So we could get better average kidney functions, return to baseline, and lower rehospitalization rates. So what we think is happening here, and again, this is all retrospective, is that our system kind of learns which patients would benefit from which treatment as we hope. And we kind of thread this needle and find the patients who should actually increase or decrease diuretics. Okay, so we have the statistical measurements. We have 41% median return to baseline versus 22%, and slightly better rehospitalization. Okay, but let me just say, everything except this is speculative. Is like what we think would have happened had they been treated differently. And we went through all these phases to increase our confidence in these estimates, but we still can't be fully confident. Okay, so should we believe? We don't really know. And the only really way to know is if we run an experiment. If we take the system, deploy it, and actually give recommendations and see what happens. Okay? And the goal of everything I was talking about is how to come into such a trial, such a clinical trial, in the best possible shape, because such a trial is expensive on many different axes, not just money-wise, and we don't want to waste this opportunity. Okay, so we are now planning the trial, and I'll go into details. I'll speak for a few minutes about that. But any questions before I go into that?
Why don't you take the more sophisticated readouts of cardiac function rather than just rehospitalization?
That's a great question. We discuss, it's like I'm nodding because it's like months of like difficult discussions. You mean like ejection fraction, echo?
Oh,
Yeah.
that's one of them.
Yeah. The upshot was some of those we don't have for all patients. Some of them, those are not recorded as outcomes, but also our clinical partners thought that we kind of went round and round, and got to the point where it said, basically rehospitalization and mortality are what we ultimately care about, and they're always measured. Yeah, but that's a good question.
Yeah, but it is a wearable in cardiac function.
Yeah, we're now applying for a grant for that, actually, for using these new wearables, right? Which could help us follow that. We could definitely do better than just these metrics. Thank you. There was a question in the back, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you could comment on like the size of the data set. How do we know that the data sets are large enough with the models that are good?
So we had about 2,000 patients, and basically we have this error bars, which tells us, yeah, if we had like 100 patients, all these error bars would be huge, right? We wouldn't know what's better. We couldn't have known this in advance, right? We had to do the analysis and see. So in this case, that means that we have enough patients and enough kind of predictive covariates to actually get some signal. But that is not always the case, of course. Yes.
On a more broader philosophical level, have you had discussions about the severity of the possible severity in outcome regarding the interventions you use for evaluation? For example, if the outcome is the risk between life or death, it's a much larger risk for you in terms of developing a machine learning model. But whereas it's something where you can modify the outcome. I suppose you have to be thinking about that.
Yes, we definitely have. We've also been looking into mortality. Mortality is for the 30-day at least is much lower, so we have less signal to work with. But we've definitely been thinking about mortality and worried about mortality. What I can say is this decision is taking place anyway. So the clinicians are making a decision anyway, and we're only making a recommendation. That helps me sleep a bit easier at night. But also there are cases where outcomes are much lower stakes, and actually that's a much nicer scenario for much easier to deploy stuff and just try out. So yeah, one of my colleagues has been working on text messages for coming to your appointment, right? And it saves money, it's important. And then they just run trials and they try all kinds of messages, and they found ways to really increase compliance, like double the compliance, just by crafting like a nice text message which kind of captures your own psychological biases. And I'm not sure that what works in Israel works here, by the way, because it was about like they tried, you're making other patients wait, or you're costing money, or you're hurting your own health. So there are all kinds of messages, and I forgot what was the most effective. And yeah, so that's a much easier setup. That's true. Yeah, sorry.
So for the trial that you're planning on this, obviously it might be tough to get the same kind of numbers of patients, right?
Yeah.
So I was just curious, this is a slightly technical question, but then do you think it will be useful to collect these kind of proxy outcomes like were mentioned here, or surrogate outcomes, I suppose?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'll mention this in a few slides. Okay, sorry.
Just had a question, is it a lot of outliers and how will it?
So these outliers this is a bootstrap estimate. We do have, you can see here, the statistical tests are quite clear that we have a strong advantage in terms of kidney function. Again, up to the fact that all these statistics are based on observational data, so can't be fully trusted. So have this extra uncertainty that we can't convey. Yeah, by everything. Like we did a lot of these kind of partitions. Sorry.
Okay, so have you seen work on, because it's not, the best case would be that there is no policy and there's a lot of variation among clinicians. But you will rarely have that, but you do have, from my experience, the clinicians tend to be more or less following guidelines, and this is a benefit. Have you seen work on sort of pseudo randomization based on the clinician?
There is a bit. David has something about. There is some work on that, on using that, but we're basically using that implicitly, but not explicitly. Yes.
But you could check in some.
Yeah. Yes, we check, and we see there is some unexplained variation, quite a lot actually. Yes. So
this is based on the Israeli population.
On one hospital.
And going back to your clinical trial, would you conduct this research in different centers, different countries, or would you say it's ethical to do so, having the Israeli population at hand? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So our model is built using Rambam data, and I would not take it and even deploy it in a different hospital in Israel. So there are two options here. One is, let's say we have data from several hospitals, how do we build a joint model, or how do we kind of fine tune or readapt the model to a new population? Okay, so I have just a few more slides. So, sorry, you're right.
Maybe just a quick question. So we have this ML policy you have described. Can we extract from it some relatively simple description of which group of patients is the one for which theoretics work and which one is the one.
That's a great question. We have some description. It's so far not fully kind of doesn't. We need the full thing. There's like when we try to distill it to a very simple rule, we don't get this. But this is still a work in progress, actually. So I'm not fully kind of comfortable saying this is the end result. We might yet find such a rule.
That will be something that gives you confidence.
Yes.
The clinicians look at it and say, "Oh yes, this actually makes sense."
So we have done that. We have looked at like, okay, who basic rules, like who is like more likely to be recommended this or that, and we have this level of validation, but not kind of a full. By the way, we might end up with here's another option. We might end up with just a super simple rule, which is great, and then we don't need all this AI. I mean, we needed it to get to the answer. It doesn't seem to be the case, but it's possible that it can happen. Okay, so I want to just talk about a few moments about our collaboration and the trial, and then we can have more questions if you have any. So just taking a step back, the hospital we're working with is a 1,000-bed tertiary hospital. It serves a population of 2 million people the north of Israel. And we have what's been helping us a lot is this joint initiative. So Frederick asked me to talk a bit about these kind of things, so it might be of interest to you. So we have this Technion Rambam initiative, which is a jointly funded center, which has money, clinician time, which is super important. I don't know how clinicians work here, but in Israel, we need to give them this research time and space for joint research. It helps us access data from Rambam, both on the regulatory front and the technical front. It makes it easier for people from the university, from the Technion University to access the data. And they also have people who will support deployment at bedside, including, again, all the regulatory and the technical aspects of that from the center. It's not all good. It's not like, I don't want to give the impression that everything is easy and kind of streamlined, but it definitely helps. In practice, what I found is a strong personal collaboration is crucial. Like you need people on board from the clinical side who really want to make this happen. I mean, otherwise, it just can't go on. So you have to have like a joint commitment to this goal and willingness to put kind of time and energy. And again, especially clinicians' time. Like usually there's some disparity. Like we want to do this, the ML people, and clinicians, they want to do this, but they have a day job, which is treating their patients. So we need kind of both. And I was lucky to find a few collaborations who are actually fully on board with this and really want to go forward. And just talking about the trial, so now we are funded for a trial for the system. So here's the plan, and I'm happy to hear kind of thoughts because this is just in the planning phase. We need to talk with the entire team, not just our kind of friends, our collaborators, but any clinician, nurse who will actually touch this model. We need to have them on board. We need to kind of teach them, hear from them what they want, where can they kind of use this, and get kind of an even deeper understanding of the clinical workflow, because we want to deploy kind of like a tablet. Where will this tablet be? At what time of day will this happen? So where exactly does the system come in? Will it be push or pull? Like, will it just pop up like, oh, this patient answers the criteria of our system, you should do this, or should the just clinician initiate the request? We're not sure about this yet. How do we randomize? So we are going to randomize. And currently our idea is as follows. So anytime the decision might come up, we flip a coin. If it falls heads, we will say, we will run our system as is. And remember that our system has a defer option. So it might just say defer. If it comes up tails, we show defer anyway. So the clinician, when they see a defer, they don't know if it's an organic defer because the system doesn't know, or if it's a defer because the coin came up tails. So that's our current idea, but it's just an idea. And the main outcomes, so that was asked here by several people. So this is a small trial. We'll have maybe 200 people. We don't have power to detect decreased mortality or something like that. This is kind of a first in human trial. We just want to see that things work. So our main outcomes are clinician acceptance, adherence, reactions. Are clinicians using this? Are they happy about this? Or do they feel kind of, this is annoying, this takes time that they don't have, things like that. Patient reactions, like how do patients feel knowing there's a system in the background? Basic safety, seeing that nothing terrible happened. And an outcome for which we might have statistical power is not the cardiac, but the kidney function, because it's a continuous measurement. So we have a bit more statistical power for that. So we are looking into that. So these are our main outcomes. We might add a continuous cardiac outcome, but it depends on how well it's recorded in the data. We're not yet sure. Yeah.
So obviously you haven't started the trial yet, but you have some sense of patient acceptance. Like you have to also recruit patients into this.
Yeah, I think they won't have a problem. And it's based on previous experience. I don't expect much resistance. I'm more worried about clinician acceptance, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so just want to say a quick advertisement. We are hiring for a postdoc or PhD student in causal inference and machine learning, joint with Michaela van der Schaar's group at Cambridge. So it's a joint Technion Cambridge collaboration. And I just want to thank all my collaborators who worked on this, and thank you very much for your time and excellent questions. So thank you.
All right, we have a few more moments for questions, so let's take some of those. Hands up.
The scenario where you have where clinicians would come, ask the system for a recommendation, how would you analyze the outcome of that? Because different clinicians might have different reasons of referring to an AI recommendation. Someone might ask easy cases, someone might ask hard cases. How do you even go about analyzing?
That's an excellent question. What we will have is whether the system can, because even when they pull, we have this randomization, right? So for the clinicians who choose to pull, does this help or not? Whatever they may be. But you're right that that's not very satisfactory, because we will need kind of a subgroup analysis to understand this, and we will not have a lot of power. Again, a lot of this is about learning how to deploy such a system, learning like how the clinicians work with it. I don't expect this to kind of find, oh, we can improve kidney function by 20% and so on. Yeah.
Has there been a lot of discussion on sort of the ethics of heads or tails and that type of evaluation?
So,
I guess it depends on how much variation they have in the current product.
Yeah, so we're starting now in IRB. This is a bit easier than standard clinical trials because we're only giving a recommendation, right? The clinician makes the decision. So I'm not super worried about this. I mean, I am worried enough to build all this framework, but I'm not too worried about the ethics, again, because the human makes the decision and because they keep telling us they have high uncertainty about how they make it anyway. So that helps a bit.
What decides when the system does not make a recommendation? Is it when the treatment effects seem to be similar, or is it when there's like a missing compounding variable?
No, when the treatment decisions are, we have these kind of, I kind of hid the slide, but we have these confidence intervals, and when they overlap, and some of these confidence intervals account for the possibility of hidden confounding. And for some patients, these might be wider. So patients which miss a certain measurement will organically have a wider interval.
So where do you see the general applicability in terms of, I got the idea that it's good for areas of uncertainty, if you like, this trade-off between goodness and hearts. And I guess, and the diabetes treatments are so variable in standard of care, including the new drugs, combining, etc. So where do you see the bigger, I guess the diabetes cohort worldwide is massive.
Yes.
So where do you see the possible payoffs for those uncertainties areas?
So I think when you have this high uncertainty about how to treat patients, but also when there's reason to believe that what we measured could be predictive of what's better. So again, for example, in psychiatric care, I mentioned the fact that we didn't have confounders, but my worry is also in psychiatric care that a lot of the variance in the outcome is due to things that we just don't measure. We don't really know why certain patients have this kind of adverse effect or not, or improve or not. It might be dependent on factors that we just don't have in the data at all, or even we don't know about scientifically. So in that case, they might, even if we had all the hidden confounders like that kind of, let's say we had a recording of the discussion between the clinician and the patient. Let's put privacy aside. Even then, I'm not sure it would have been good enough.
Where, with recent diabetes, you can get a lot of measurements.
Exactly, measurements which are very relevant to the outcome. Yes.
But it's still not clear.
Yeah, so we can't know for sure. Yeah. Sorry.
One last question, I think.
Yes. I know they're true. Yeah.
How do you handle new medication? Is there a risk there will be a lock-in of old medication, which is in medical therapy already, or how do you handle a new medication coming in?
We can't. I mean, we had this exactly for diabetes. We had a new medication which only a small set of patients were receiving, and we didn't have a lot of follow-up. So we needed at least a year or 18 months of follow-up when we didn't have that. So we couldn't say, we can't know. But let me just say, new medications do give us a causal opportunity because there is kind of a natural trial here. Because once it comes in, we can compare the patients who came in, a month after the new medication was available and a month before, and we could say they're kind of the same, and just randomly these came a month later and we're eligible for the new medication. So that could help us. But we still need to wait until we have enough people and enough follow-up to estimate anything about that.
Do you get full access to the phase 3 trial data in the first place?
No, we do not. No, this is about based on observational, like what happens in the clinic. Getting access to trial data is like getting water from the stone. That's what someone told me once. Nigam Shah said that to me once. Sorry.
We're gonna have to wrap there, unfortunately. But
I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, if you have more questions for Uri, please find him during the day. And tomorrow, Uri is also visiting Chalmers and giving a talk there. So if you're around, then come there. But before that, thanks, Uri, again.
Thank you.